Welcome back to the Nate Wenke Podcast. And today, the topic is going to be the psychology of the comment section, which is quite the exploration, let me tell you. The old idea about YouTube comments being the Wild West is very true. And I've experienced that firsthand. And if you ever want to just go have some fun, go look up a YouTube video on like something controversial, something in the religious dimension or political dimension, and then go read the comments. And it is fascinating what people will say, what they will argue about. Absolutely fascinating. You may also have, one of the side effects of doing this is you'll despair about the fundamental nature of humans, but it is fun to do, I will say. It is quite fun to do. So the impetus for this podcast was, well, my own experience primarily. One of the consequences of putting your information out there to the world is that you're going to get feedback, which overall is good. I wanted feedback. That was a large part of the point of doing this, is it forces me to see, how stupid I am, essentially. Really stupid or just less stupid. So that's good. Feedback is good, but feedback is only good when it's constructive. It's only good when it actually provides you with something that's tangible and you can actually use to improve yourself. If it's vitriolic keyboard warrior type hatred, that's just not useful. You can't really do anything with that. So, and unfortunately, most of the feedback that you get in a comment section is normally not nuanced, not complex, not with your best interest in mind. It's normally made by someone that had a really bad day and saw whatever you said and said, you know what, screw this guy. We're gonna make his day as bad as mine. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you might actually genuinely say something stupid and you need someone to tell you that you're an idiot, which is useful. But a lot of the times, negative comments are incredibly vitriolic, not nuanced. That's the opposite of what they are. And they're just not very useful. But what's so fascinating is that even though they're not useful, even though you can understand the statistics on who exactly comments and why, and the distributions, it doesn't matter to some extent because you're going to have a negative reaction. It's almost impossible not to have some kind of a negative reaction. And it's absolutely fascinating because I'm someone that understands the psychology relatively well in terms of the distribution of people that are actually going to comment on anything. And yet you still just you can let one bad comment ruin your day if you're not careful. And it is fascinating. And then trying to respond in a nuanced manner is just a lost cause. And yet you're tempted to do it because you want to defend yourself. And part of the background here is, and this is one of the main topics I wanted to talk about, was the documentary called The Social Dilemma. And if you haven't seen this documentary, I highly recommend it. Tristan Harris is the director, and he has spent many, many years studying human psychology. He actually worked at Google as an ethicist for a while, and he was fascinated by the engineering and the consequences of social media at mass scale like we see today, where a handful of engineers in a room can tweak an algorithm to change the reality that you perceive on your smartphone. And that kind of influence and that kind of power is completely unprecedented in human history. And this documentary was it did such a good job of exploring the implications of this. And frankly, there could have been another 10 documentaries on each of the subpoints. And the irony, of course, is The documentary focuses on the fact that these are complex things and we have complex problems to solve that require long-form conversation in a nuanced way. And yet, social media and most of the interwebs is the opposite platform for those conversations. Social media is not renowned for its long-form, nuanced conversations at all. Now, the exception to this, and I think this is actually quite optimistic to some extent, is long-form podcasts and YouTube videos. And this is part of the reason that I got into this endeavor, whatever this is. And part of this reason is because I myself got absolutely fascinated by long-form podcasts and long-form YouTube videos. And it started for me with Jordan Peterson, watching 3-hour lectures on, the first sentence of Genesis when I was 18, because, that's what your average 18-year-old does. And it morphed into, I almost couldn't consume quick content, which is somewhat counterintuitive given what we at least perceive about people's attention span day to day. But I found the long-form conversation so interesting, which is part of the reason I wanted to do this. Now, the reality is most people don't actually go listen to the full 30-minute, hour-long podcast. At least for me. They will if it's Joe Rogan, as they should, because he's awesome. But a lot of people will listen to shorts or quick clips. And, the end goal is that they'll listen to those and then go actually listen to the podcast. Of course, that rarely actually happens. But, you got to start somewhere. But back to the social dilemma. So Tristan Harris made some really, really good points. And one of those that I've talked about before is we have this higher sensitivity to negative news and negative emotion. So you could, in the context of comments, you could get 10 positive comments, and then you can get just one negative. And that one negative, it will stand out to you way more and way out of proportion compared to the 10 other positive comments. Statistically, it's just 10% or 8% or whatever that is. But on an emotional level, on a reaction-based level, you're going to, that could ruin your day, even within the context of the other 10 comments, which is so fascinating. And I've talked about this before, but there's a relatively well thought out evolutionary theory surrounding why exactly we're more, let's say, in tune with negative emotion. And it basically just has to do that with the negative emotion, it turns out can kill you if you don't pay attention to it, versus positive emotion, there's a good chance it's not going to be overly detrimental if you miss it. So from an evolutionary perspective, we're going to be more predisposed to react with greater intensity to potentially negative information than positive information. And what this does is, even when there's a statistical analysis of the percentage of positive feedback to negative feedback that you're getting, if you're getting 20% negative feedback, it's still, you're going to have an outsized emotional reaction that isn't actually statistically based. It's just not going to be, which is so fascinating that we're wired that way. And Tristan had a really good quote here that I want to reference. Our online news feeds aggregate all of the world's pain and cruelty, dragging our brains into a kind of learned helplessness. Technology that provides us with a near complete knowledge without a commensurate level of agency isn't humane. And I thought that summarized it so well, because we have access to just all of this information, and yet we don't really have any tangible way to change it. And from a evolutionary perspective and human psychology perspective, this is so completely foreign. We've never had access to this, ever, and even close, which means that we're going to have a biological reaction that isn't reasonable to what's going on here. And it's very useful to know, and kind of back to one of my points, like, just because you know it, just because you watched The Social Dilemma and you understand that Google's algorithms are, pushing you in a particular direction, doesn't, inoculate you from that very nudge, that very pushing that they're doing, which is so fascinating that you can actually know something, intellectually, and yet it doesn't matter. You're still going to have, a very similar emotional reaction. And that doesn't mean it's not useful to know the thing. I still think it's very useful to understand the fact that these algorithms their entire goal is to make you click. It has nothing to do with, the algorithms have nothing to do with trying to make you be a better person or feel better or be in a better emotional state or have higher self-esteem. No, they want to make you click more. And you can know that, and yet it doesn't affect, generally speaking, your emotional reactions to things, which is so fascinating. And it goes to the point again of the fact that there are forces within us that we don't understand, that I think we tend to underestimate. I think we tend to underestimate just how impacted we are by mechanisms and biological impulses within us that are subconscious. And this would be a Freudian point, I suppose. The unconscious, or also probably Carl Jung, would be quite in support of this, that we're not creatures that have really authored much of our situation, our reactions. It's very difficult to be a calibrated person in the context of regulating your emotional state and your reactions to things. And that's just, something that you can learn. Like, it's certainly something that you can work on. In some sense, that's growing up, learning to control your emotions and having a more measured reaction to stimulus or stimuli. But it doesn't make it easy. And even the most in control person is still subject to the whims of their biological impulses to a certain degree. So it's interesting how that works. Another point that Tristan made was that we're social creatures at our core, and I've mentioned this before, that throughout history and throughout our evolutionary process, those that didn't have a group, those that were cast out of the tribe, that were outsiders, they died. And as we developed language, as we became more social, we developed and our brain size increased. So there was a positive evolutionary bias towards you being more socially connected and more well respected by your community and your tribe. That helped you father more offspring, and your genetic code went farther. So there's this whole evolutionary theory, which in my opinion holds a lot of weight behind why we're so social. And it also, shows why we're so tribalistic, and why it's part of the reason why there's such a high level of polarization in America today. Although I heard an interesting point about the whole polarization thing the other day, and yeah, we certainly are polarized, but are we more polarized than 1860 in the Civil War? If we really think about it, I'm not convinced that we are. Because, they actually got out of their houses and got out of their basements and stopped, endlessly scrolling Netflix, and got up and decided to go kill people because they were so polarized. So it's not totally clear how polarized we really are and how we act. And on this action point too, this is interesting, is so much of our interaction with other people is behind this shield of a screen, or in the extreme cases, it's behind a shield of anonymity. On Twitter, you can have an anonymous account. So you can go be as vitriolic, as absolutely denigrating, and as much of a piece of human debris as you want, and you suffer effectively no consequence for it. That's a recipe in terms of incentive structure for disaster. That seems like a really bad idea. And yet, that anonymity factor is very common throughout different forms of social media. And I think that's a serious problem, specifically Twitter. And I'm not quite sure what the best way to deal with it is. There's a couple different competing interests. I'm sympathetic to the idea that having anonymity promotes people to say things that otherwise they wouldn't dare say in the context of a corrective mechanism. In terms of, you could make a free speech argument that the more freedom people have to, go against the tribe or go against the common narrative, the better. The problem with that is it's such an extreme form, anonymity, and you're already sheltered. Even if you have an account, you're already sheltered by the fact that you're behind a screen. That I don't know if it's worth the cost of the increased vitriolic language and content that comes out of the fact of anonymity. It's an interesting debate, but overall, I'm relatively on the side of the fact that anonymity is a net negative in terms of discourse overall on the interwebs. Back to this social approval thing. So we're highly wired for social approval. This is part of the reason that social media is so addicting. I mean, that like button, that little notification, that damn notification that you get, I mean, you're going to get an instant dopamine hit the second you see that. So it is very addicting. And I was someone that, really didn't give a damn about social media. And then I jumped into this world for a variety of reasons, which I've gone over before. And I thought I would be relatively inoculated from the like button, let's say. And I still think I am more than the average person, but it's amazing how much it can affect your mood when you get more views or more likes or whatever metric you want to point out there. It's fascinating how much it can affect your mood. I don't particularly like it, that aspect necessarily, but then I'll get feedback from a friend like, hey, that made me think a ton and that was super useful. And then it makes it worth it. So it's, it's a constant cost benefit, but here we are and we're going to see what happens. Another really good quote from Tristan Harris about our need for social approval goes like this: we're all vulnerable to social approval. The need to belong, to be approved or appreciated by our peers is among the highest human motivations, but now our social approval is in the hands of tech companies. And this goes back to that point of the fact that a couple engineers in a room are deciding what content gets promoted, and algorithms are deciding, to a certain extent, how much social approval you get. And I mean, there are a range of consequences from this. Tristan talks a lot about, the rise of depression, specifically in young girls. It's a terrifying trend. The rates of suicide, depression, anxiety in young girls specifically. It's definitely increased in young boys, but not to the same extent at all. And it has a lot to do with, I think, the fact that in general, the social image and, well, let's take a step back here. From a psychological perspective, women are higher in trait neuroticism, which is essentially proclivity towards negative emotion. So they're already wired, let's say, to react with greater intensity to negative emotion. And they also, to a certain extent, and I don't know why, seem to care more about image and self-esteem and body image. And I think it might be partially because I think women derive more of their identity, maybe might be the right word. Who they are from their image in a way that men just don't care about. Like, men typically don't care about their looks to the same extent that females do. And it's partially because of selective mechanisms in mating, where men care more about looks than women do. Women care more about status, money, and those kind of things than men do. So there's a bit of a disconnect there statistically. But regardless of the reasons, it's happening. And it's not entirely clear what to do about it, especially because the algorithms are only going to get more sophisticated. I've talked extensively about ChatGPT and the fact that it's just going to take over everything, which, with some caveats, of course. But, ChatGPT is a type of algorithm to a certain extent, and you can imagine that the more sophisticated these algorithms get, and the more they're given access and trained on human psychology, and the more specified they are to you, the greater ability they're going to have to feed you exactly what you want to see. And this is an interesting debate about targeted ads too. Like, part of me doesn't mind targeted ads. Like, I'd rather see an ad about something relevant to me than not. But everything comes with a cost, and it's not clear how much cost is going on in that and how much benefit I'm getting because of it. So, I don't know the calculus there, but it's an interesting debate. I tend to err on the line of caution, or on the side, I suppose, in the sense that a certain amount of targeted ads makes sense. At what point are they crossing a line? That's not clear. It depends on how much you care about privacy. Again, these are complicated things, very, very complicated. But it's good to think about, and it's good because, these are just going to keep coming down the pipeline, and we're just going to have to keep dealing with them. So, that's very important. I want to get into a bit of a texting versus calling debate. I have this with my friends quite often, and people in general. I am known as someone that hates texting in my friend group, and it makes me feel old, but I still think it's very true. If I'm going to have a conversation with someone, keyword conversation, you simply can't have it over text. If you want it to even remotely resemble human conversation and human interaction, text is extremely far removed from that. And look, text has its uses. I'm not saying it doesn't. But if you want to have more than a line or two discussion, you should call, or you should see the person in person, or you should FaceTime. In my opinion, there are very little situations where text trumps phone calls. Now, there are some, and like, for example, when you run a business, it's way easier sometimes to text your clients than actually just call them every time. It's the utility of emails. They don't have to respond right away. So look, there's a ton of uses for it. I'm not saying that, but for anything that is remotely above surface level, you should call. Like period. And this is an interesting point. I can't. I'll have friends that will say that they ended up breaking up with someone over text, and I just can't stand that. I will rip them a new one. I'm like, that is the most pathetic thing, to break up with someone over text. I think that is such weak shit. Go talk to the person. Go see them. It's just to hide behind your phone is ridiculous on something as serious as that. And it makes it so much easier to be a coward. So go talk to the person if you're in that situation. And I mean, look, here's my sympathetic side. It doesn't mean it's easy. Like, come on, it's not easy. You're going to experience a whole lot more negative emotion, but you probably owe it to the other person to have a bloody in-person conversation. And if you can't, because of distance or because you've only been dating a bloody month and you call them, those are different situations. But in general, seeing them in person should trump. Certainly texting, and should trump phone calls too. I can't stand that. But here's an example where I would probably differ from most people, and I don't understand why. If I'm fortunate enough to have someone ask me how my day was, and I get that text towards the end of the day, I do not want to respond over text. I would much rather call the person, especially if I'm driving home. It's easy. Just chuck them on a call, and then you can have a real conversation about how your day was. And I don't understand trying to type out 50 paragraphs of text about how your day was, or about anything, frankly. Now, I've heard an interesting argument about this, that sometimes, writing things down is easier because you can get your thoughts in a more cohesive manner before you send it. And I totally get that. I totally do. So I get that in terms of a utility for texting. I guess I would say, just put it in your notes and then have a conversation over the phone or in person later. I don't understand why that then necessitates the texting to send that material. You can simply use the function of the fact that, or the advantage of the fact that you can write stuff down outside of texting as a medium in terms of communication. So that would be my 2 cents there about the whole texting versus calling thing. Here's some crazy statistics that I found that I think are relevant here. So about 25% of children receive phones by age 10.7, apparently. And then about 75% by age 12.6. And then basically nearly all children have phones by age 15. And then if you look up, screen time percentages, it's pretty rough. On average, children spend about 4 to 6 hours per day watching and using screens in the age group 8 to 12. And then teenagers, on average, it's about 8.2 hours. It depends on, who you're asking. The point is it's a lot. And here we are in the most connected age in history, and yet our level of human interaction, especially when you're kids, when it should be at its highest, is terrifyingly low. And there's a bunch of really, really good psychological data about childhood development in terms of critical periods in time where learning to socialize and learning to negotiate is critical. And if you don't do it, you're going to have a lot of problems later on in life. So that's part of the reason why this is actually such a big deal, because it turns out that we're not able to communicate anymore, which is huge. I have this rule about texting and calling too, while we're on this issue. I will never have an argument over text. I just refuse to do so. I'll shut it down and I'll say, call me. And it serves me really well, because it's tempting sometimes to just respond back with a quick jab, a little bit of vitriol. But it is a horrible idea. Not only because what you say can be so vastly misinterpreted because of the poor medium of text, but also because, there's a high probability that you're not going to actually solve the problem, because there's a time factor in terms of how much you can your words per minute essentially over text versus a calling. Conversation's always going to be faster. I mean, look, some people might disagree with me. There's probably those super texters out there that are like, 150 words per minute or some crazy shit. But overall, conversations are just going to be faster. And then on top of that, you're just missing all of the human cues, all of the subtle ways in which we say things. There's no intonation when you're texting someone. So calling wins, in my opinion, almost always. And I'm down to have that debate with anyone. So now we get to the fun part of the episode. This is actually the initial reason I wanted to do it, was because I thought it would be fun to read off some of the comments that I've gotten, just for fun. Those are the top ones, of course. But before I get to that, so I have this rule, and this has served me really well, even though it still can't completely calibrate my emotional response to things. It's still really useful to know this rule, and it's a general rule, but roughly speaking, it's true. Is whenever you post something, especially from a content perspective, if you're putting out content, 90% of people have a neutral, maybe somewhat positive, somewhat negative reaction to what you're saying. And then 10% have either so I guess 5% and 5%. 5% have a really positive reaction, and 5% have a really negative reaction. And again, this is just to make a point. It's going to differ on what you're talking about. If you talk about religion or politics, that's probably going to get skewed a ton. These people are going to have way more intense reactions on average to something like that. But as a general rule, it's good to know that most people look at it or don't look at it and have a basic, relatively neutral reaction, with little or no care about what's going on. And then you might get, if someone has an overly positive reaction, you might get a like, or you might get a thumbs up, or whatever it bloody is. You might. But if someone has a negative reaction, like a really negative reaction, their only forum to really show their vitriol and their hatred of whatever you promoted is to comment on it. And man, you get some fascinating comments because of this statistical reality. And like I said, I know that, basically 90% of people are going to look at something and have a fairly neutral reaction. I know that 5% are going to have a pretty positive reaction. They might like it, whatever. Might get a positive comment, maybe. And then 5% are going to hate it or not like it. And a lot of them are going to comment. So it's a useful rule to know. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean that I escape the emotional reaction that you're going to have to a certain extent, no matter how much intellectual knowledge you have about something. Back to the fact that we're wired so intensely towards negative emotion. So back to the fun part here. Okay, so I got some top comments here that I wanna go through. I had a video on like the fact that we're social creatures and solitary confinement is, like, in my opinion, a form of torture and should be listed as cruel and unusual punishment, because we're so social as apes as we are. And this was a good one. One person commented, "Oh Jesus, please shut the F up," which is a really good point. And I've seriously considered that, and I think I'm going to change my ways and, really just not ever talk at all. I think that's probably the best solution here. I got another one that said no one needs you in their lives. That was also a really good point. I generally would agree that, me as a human being and my consciousness probably just shouldn't exist. I think that's probably good policy for life. So that seems reasonable to me. And I really take these to heart and really want to let these people know that I really appreciate their nuanced and well thought out arguments about my perspective. So I really appreciate that. I had another one. Okay, this is probably my favorite of all time. This one right here. So I had a clip on the fact that in order to have like a true connection with someone, you have to be vulnerable. I know it's shocking. And this person wrote that he thinks that I'm a Down syndrome kid that found a thesaurus, which, I don't know, my immediate reaction to it was like, really, you should have said dictionary, not thesaurus? Like, come on, man. Like, it's probably a better analogy to say dictionary than thesaurus, but thesaurus sounds more interesting, I think, so I think that's what he was going for. And, you know, the first part about mental illness, like, I thought that was, like, cancelable now. Like, aren't you not supposed to make fun of people with mental illnesses? Like, I thought that was like a big no-no. So that was pretty impressive. I was like, man, that's kind of bold. So that was I would say that's probably my favorite negative comment. If I had to rank order it, that's probably my favorite. So that was pretty good. Oh, here's another one. I did a quote on Brave New World about, well, I think the title was a quote. I'm, reading a quote on Brave New World, and someone commented, how about you read the whole thing and not just a quote, Slim? And I thought that was a really good point, that I should probably just read the book in its entirety on air. I thought that was a really good point, so I appreciate that. Another comment here about a video about deep fakes. Turn up the music a little bit. I can still hear you. I was like, okay, interestingly enough, they were right. The music was too loud. So I thought that was a really good, one of the few somewhat constructive negative comments. I was like, all right, a little bit of constructiveness there. I'd say that those were my favorites. I have a most hilarious comment I've ever received. So this one is pretty good. I put out a clip about the fact that I think that life is meaningful, or it has to be, in order for us to live and function in the world. I know, shocking. And this person wrote, meaning of my life is wiggling in the dirt and mud while biting people's ankles whenever they come over to ask if I'm okay. And that one, I think, wins for the most unique, hilarious, fascinating comment I have ever read, at least on my own material. So I'm going to end with that wiggling in the dirt comment, because I think that's a really good place to end. But yeah, it turns out that the comments are quite the cesspool of vitriolic haters. So anyway, if you ever want to laugh, go look at the comments. Thanks for listening.